The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is.
That was the poem The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. The poem grapples with perspective and the bias brought by the human mind. Before I jump into the contents of the poem, first we must look at the author behind it. Wallace Stevens was a prominent poet in the early 19th century. He was born in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1879, and he earned his undergraduate degree at Harvard University in the year 1900. From there he studied to become a lawyer, but poetry was never far from his mind. He had many friends interested in poetry, such as E. E. Cummings. In 1914, under the name Peter Parasol, he sent a group of his poems to a notable literary figure of the time, Harriet Monroe. His work was published, and this became one of the first real successes in his literary career. From there he published many poems, but what made him unique was his focus on imagination and its ability to transform our reality. This is one of the major points of discussion in his poem, The Snowman, and it poses ideas regarding the lens that different people see the world through. In order to show the ideas of imagination presented in the poem, it is important to analyze the many nuances of the poem and how they are used to show that our imagination makes us see the world in a biased way. This analysis will also show the idea of different perspectives presented in the poem. Before delving in the poem, the first thing to pay attention to is the title. The Snowman is not about the wonderful creation made in the backyards of children during the summer. The Snowman regards a normal man accustomed to the snow with his own perspective on the world. Looking at the entirety of the poem, you will notice that there is only one period at the very end. Instead, there are two semicolons in the poem. For those well versed in grammar, this means that the clauses after the semicolon are related to the clauses before it. The poem does not follow a certain rhyme scheme, and instead uses something called free verse, which does not rhyme. Now before we dive into the details of the poem and how Stevens gets his message across, the surface meaning of the poem is important to consider. The poem is basically telling the reader that a mind of winter is necessary to appreciate a winter landscape, and as the poem continues with the wintry landscape description, the last stanza brings in the idea of the listener regarding the nothingness of the landscape. So how exactly does this relate to the ideas of imagination and differing perspectives? Well, in order to see this, we need to analyze the poem based on the two major parts. The first part seems to be describing the snowman himself, a person who has been cold for a long time and is well accustomed to the wintry conditions he faces. The second part includes the last two stanzas and has an overall, more negative tone compared to that of the first four stanzas. The first part of the poem regards the person that is able to see the land without misery very highly. The person described in the beginning of the poem is able to look at the pine trees and junipers and feel no misery. What Stevens is getting at here is that normally a person who sees this wintry scene might feel despair, but not the snowman. Instead, the snowman beholds the landscape, implying awe and wonder that most people who haven't been cold a long time would not experience. In the first part of the poem, it seems to be written with a bias towards the snowman, meaning the wintry landscape is seen with a lens that makes it seem pleasant. However, in the fourth stanza, there seems to be a new lens that looks at the winter as a barren place. In the description of the wind, the author writes about it as if it is a tired thing. The use of the word same is indicative of the idea that the wind and the bare landscape are not appealing. This fourth stanza is where a shift takes place that changes the poem from a positive view towards winter to a more realistic and darker view. In the last stanza, when the listener is introduced, the topic of nothingness is as well. This last stanza says that the listener beholds the nothingness that is not there and the nothingness that is. On top of this, the listener himself is nothing. This is the last part of the poem, and arguably the most important part. The true meaning behind the poem is finally expressed after the build-up in the previous stanzas. This meaning is the idea that we can truly not look upon something without bias. The listener in the poem is able to see that nothing truly exists. The only time something actually exists is if we are able to perceive it. The snowman described in the poem is able to regard the snow without seeing the misery of it because he realizes that his own perception and imagination is what is making him see the misery of the scene. Looking at the more minute details of the poem, there are a few words that appear multiple times throughout the poem that are of significance. Behold is a very important word that is seen in both parts of the poem. It is used in the same way to show that the person is doing more than just perceiving, but beholding the landscape or nothingness. Beholding is more powerful than perceiving, according to Stevens, it seems. The other word is in the second part of the poem. This word is same. It hints at the dreariness and the misery held by the wind and the bare landscape. After seeing the deep meaning hidden in this poem, it is important to realize that Stevens is very invested in our personal bias and his imagination. His book, called A Necessary Angel, was a collection of essays on reality and the imagination, so he is very well versed in this topic and the philosophy behind it. The way this poem was presented, as multiple metaphors of a similar idea, seems very confusing, but it is very clever when you think about it. The first metaphor about the snowman being a mind of winter is very clever and shows the differing perspectives that people can have, but the second metaphor is very philosophical and honestly cool. The second metaphor about the mind of winter being a mind that entertains nothingness is present by the fact that our imagination is what turns nothing into something. Our imagination is what really turns our world into how we see it today. The idea that the snowman is able to realize this and therefore not pass judgment on whether the winter is miserable really makes one think, which is probably the goal that Stevens had in writing The Snowman.